Hey everyone, it's Ed Gutowski, and what I wanted to do today was to create a video where we talk about, give you some background onto the fable called The Appointment of Samara. And notice we're shifting gears because we've talked about mythic criticism. Now we're going to talk about fables and thematic criticism. And so what we can think about if we think about a fable, what a fable is a very, very short story, right? A fable generally can be just a paragraph, generally no longer than a page, but it's a short story, right? And in order for us to understand what a fable means, we might look for themes within it, right? What is the author trying to argue? What is an important message of the fable? And sometimes you can think of something like fables, probably the most popular fables are something like Aesop's fables. Aesop's fables generally can be about, 4 to 5 sentences. And the thing about Aesop's fables is at the end, he always tells you the moral of the story. So that's one of the reasons why I don't like Aesop's fables, because Aesop at the end will tell you the moral or the theme of the story. Whereas I like it where if you read a fable, you have to critically think to understand it. And that's one of the reasons why I like to use The Appointment in Samara. And sometimes students read The Appointment in Samara and they kind of struggle at first. They don't kind of get it, and then they have to read it a couple of times. So with this video, I wanted to give you kind of an understanding of The Appointment in Samara. So if we look at the fable is set in Iraq, right? And I always imagine if I'm creating a movie, and you can kind of think of things like Amelia's, The Lottery, and The Appointment in Samara, they're kind of like a Twilight Zone episodes. So if I were to make The Appointment in Samara a Twilight episode, movie or TV show, right? I'd be zooming over the earth. I'd zoom down and I'd zoom over the Middle East and I'd zoom into Iraq and I'd zoom into Baghdad. And there I am in Baghdad in this crowded market. And I think, how cool would it be to be in a market in Baghdad? Think of all the smells, the spices, the food you could eat, the people, the different cultures. So here we are in this big, huge market. And from behind, we see the head of a servant. And the servant is part of this crowd. He's bumping into people, and he turns a corner, and there he sees death. And death points at him. So the servant freaks out, right? He runs away, and he goes back to his master's house, and he gets on his horse, and he gallops all the way to the town of Samara. And when the master finds out about this, he's furious. He's pissed. So he goes back to the market and he's pushing people out of the way and he sees Death and he gets in Death's face and he says, "What's up, Death? Why are you making fun of my servant? What are you doing?" And Death says, "Well, I was surprised to see the servant because I have an appointment with him later today in Samara." And sometimes in a ground class, I'll ask students, well, how many people thought the story was funny? And a lot of students raise their hand and I've got, well, you've got a twisted sense of humor because that poor servant is going to be dead soon. And so there's a lot of ways we can look at the story. What's the point of the story? What's the theme, the moral of the argument? And look, an easy theme is you can't be afraid of death. An easy theme can be fate. And what I like to do is to kind of ask students to dig deeper and go beyond just simplistic themes, go beyond just death or fate. You can't escape death, you can't escape fate. So if we go back and look at the story and we look at death, there's something different about death. Because here, death is a woman. And notice that changes everything. Because by making death a woman, it changes kind of what our ideas of death might be. Because notice death, historically, we might think of death as the Grim Reaper, having a cloak over his head, carrying a scythe. But here, death is a woman. And that sometimes surprises students, right? Because if we have death as a woman, but it makes sense because think about it, we're all going to die. We were all born from a woman. So why wouldn't it would make sense if when we die, death is a woman? And think about there's some irony in the story as well, because think about the story set in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, women are sometimes treated very terribly. They're treated as second-class citizens. They have to kind of cover their faces. So it would make, so there may be some irony in setting this story in the Middle East and kind of, hey, payback for treating women terribly. And that opens up the door for feminism to be a theme. And another theme we could think about is why is the servant afraid of death, right? Is he afraid of death or is he afraid of women? Well, that could open some LGBTQ issues as well if we wanted to look at the story through that lens, right? And I always wonder, maybe the theme is that death has a sense of humor and that death is bored. Because if you think about it, death's sitting around, what does death do? Oh, I got to go to the retirement community. Oh, there's another old person. So death is kind of bored. He says, you know what, I'm just going to look over. What happens if I just point at that one person over there? And oh, well, look at that. That person ran away. I really freaked out that person. So maybe death is bored or death has a sense of humor. Now, given the fact that the story is told from the narrator's point of view and it's told from death, the question is, do we really trust death? And I always wonder, right, if the theme is don't fear death, notice, because there's an argument that the story is about the slave sort of master relationship, because a master kind of so brutalizes and traumatizes their servant that they're afraid of everything. They're afraid even of something like death, whereas the master, he wasn't afraid. He pushed people out of the way. He confronted death. He talked to death. He challenged death. And what would have happened if the servant had just gone up to death and challenged him as well? And he said, hey, why are you pointing at me? And death would have said, well, I'm surprised you have an appointment with you later. And you could have been, well, let's take a look at your book. Oh, here you are in Samara. Oh, yeah, but that's like 3 years from now, right? So why not, right, confront death, right? Because we confront death, then we're confronting life. Now, oftentimes students may have the best interpretation of this story. So I one time had a student who had an interpretation of the story. And this is why I think it's important. Go big and go bold in your theme. Don't go easy. It's easy to say the story is about fate or death. So I one time had a student, now this is years ago, I had a student who had served in Iraq, the Iraq War. And he had served in the initial invasion of Baghdad. And he thought he said, hey, look, I think the story is about the war in Iraq. And I said, well, how did you come up with that conclusion? And he said, well, look, here's the thing, right? He was part of the initial invasion into Iraq, right? So, when they initially got to Baghdad, they were able to liberate Baghdad. It looked like the war was going to be easy. Everyone was happy. And what changed everything was that in Samara, there was a beautiful mosque. It was one of the most beautiful churches, one of the beautiful mosques. And all of a sudden, terrorists blew up this mosque. And it was when that happened that everyone in the military said, oh my gosh, this isn't going to be easy as it appears. This is going to be a long and bloody war. And notice, while that is a bit of a stretch, it does make for an interesting a theme. So, and it makes for an interesting paper. So I want you to think about going big and going bold in your ideas when you're looking at themes, right? Don't try to just pick the easy way out, because sometimes they can be really kind of interesting and engaging. So I'll look forward to seeing what you think about the appointment in Samara and what you think of thematic criticism.